Today, folks, we're going to be talking about how to use visual aids to be able to help you in your presentations. We talk visual aids. We could be talking in a lot of different formats, but in particularly things like visual slides, whether you're using Google Slides, PowerPoint, even if you're using Prezi, the same design rules apply. So we're going to talk a little bit today about how to use these kinds of technologies to augment our message. In other words, it's time for us to figure out how we can use audio-visual aids to be able to help us tell and sell. So what's our outline? We're going to be looking at how we are designing our whole presentation in terms of actually performing an outline, getting a strategic purpose together and creating visuals based on an outline so that we are fulfilling the reason why the presentation exists in the first place. Then we're going to talk about how to make our slides look good. What about our masters? Then about how we can use design principles so that we are getting the right amount of content on each individual slide, i.e. how many bullets, how we indent, those sorts of things, and then actually using other kinds of visual aids, things like flip charts. So to break these down a little bit, we're going to talk about the process of drafting first and how to build connections between our slides and the type of slides you might use if we're using things like visuals, if we're using heavy use of pictures versus text, and then how to effectively put colors to our advantage. And then we're also going to be talking about how to actually make effective use of things like titles and graphical charts and making sure we're not overwhelming our audience with too much content. Again, how do we edit? Then we'll finally have a brief discussion about how we use these actual devices depending on the purpose for which they were created and the medium. For example, there's times we're going to be in a room with a projector talking to a live crowd. There are going to be other times, for example, we're using things such as slide decks, which means we're leaving things behind. These same approaches, by the way, are also relevant whether you're in person or you're doing something like a Zoom call or an online type of presentation. So some philosophy to think about here. We've all been in presentations where the presenter seems to be beholden to their slides. So in other words, the visual aid is what the presenter is actually writing. I like the idea that the presenter is driving the presentation in the visual aid, and in this case the presenter is dragging this mule along as opposed to the mule dragging him. So our visual aids, our presentation tools should be things that help us, not things that we are beholden to. We should be using them as tools. So why are visuals important? Again, most people are visual learners. I'm a rare exception to the fact that I'm a text-based learner, so I have to work sometimes extra hard at making my visuals work well because I learn better by reading. Most people do not. We need to think of it as an overall type of approach, however, because we've got visuals, we've got text, and we've got audio. We've got three ways to reach somebody and reinforce our ideas. We refer to it as a trimodal approach. It's also a great opportunity if you've got consistent branding with what you're putting on your slides, what you're saying, and what you're using with your visuals. Again, more ways we give people to latch onto our content. The more we have that type of approach, the better off we are. It's also important to realize that your audience can absorb and take in information and process it quicker than we can say it. So why not make use of other things such as the text or visuals on our screens to be able to make our message stick? So let's jump into it in terms of how we design our presentation from the get-go. This is our starting point. I think a good place to start, my personal preference is to start with an outline. Think about why you're doing this presentation in the first place. Think about why you're building these slides in the first place and build your outline. Build a scaffold. I like to use Microsoft Word or word processing software such as Google Docs to build out the outline before I start creating a single slide. And think about who you're presenting to as well. If you're going to an older audience, for example, they may want more detail. They may be okay with more text. And the flip side is, in a multi-generational workforce, we also have to think about the fact we've got people of all kinds of visual acuity as well. Older individuals may not like smaller fonts, for example. You got to think about the presentation as a whole. So I like the idea of designing the beginning and the ending of the deck together, the slide presentation together. Why? So we can make sure that what we're trying to promote at the beginning, that we're actually wrapping up and accomplishing. We can see that we've hit all of our key points. It's also important in all the slides, for example, that you have, make standalone sense. If we look at one of these slides by themselves, particularly headings, which we'll talk a little bit more about, do they make sense on their own, or are they so tied into abbreviations that they do not make standalone sense? And again, avoiding the use of generic titles. We'll talk more about this when we get into headings as well. Another great idea is if you're making use of animation, you can use those to build your opening slides, so you're putting emphasis on one point at a time. I also like the idea, if you are using some sort of an agenda, to leave it up during your question and answer. Why? Well, it shows that you've covered all the topics, and it also gives, at the end of the presentation, your audience a chance to be able to maybe remember questions they wanted to ask. That's particularly important if you save the Q&A to the end of the presentation. So what about your opening slide? How do you grab attention right from the get-go? You could have a blank screen, which means the audience is going to be looking squarely at you. You could have a title of the presentation, which gives people a reason why they're in the room, or you could have something we call a grabber slide. And that's something that's thought-provoking or just provocative. It could be an image, it could be a statistic, it could be any of these things that help us get attention from the get-go. Any of these approaches can work really well depending on your strategy and your personality. So again, here's an example. Let me make that a little bigger for you all about how we can have effective versus ineffective opening slides. The agenda is a generic title. The more specific we get, we have invest in technocrat, for example, and you notice there's also a conceptual parallelism to the bullets. If you're starting one bullet with a verb, start them all with a verb. Make consistency happen in your presentation. Make it easy for your audience to be able to interpret. Here's a way not to open a presentation. In addition to the fact this is a horrendously designed slide with a hard-to-read font over a busy background, there's too much information. There's just not any way of telling where this presentation is easily going. So don't bowl over your audience with too much information right off the get-go. Other bad ideas. I think it's great to have your projector off or muted when you're getting your slides set up. Why? Well, when you're starting your presentation, you may notice a typo on your opening slide, something you want to fix. Well, having that muted from the audience is way better. And again, I also think it's bad, generally speaking, to end with a black slide, although I do it on occasion myself. I'm not perfect either. I may even do that in this presentation because sometimes I just do. Shutting down PowerPoint also immediately at the end of your presentation or ending with a black slide. This can be bad because they seem sudden. If you know the black slide is coming, that's not so bad. You can leave it up and put the emphasis back on you as the presenter. But again, try not to have an abrupt end to your presentation. All your slides that come out should support what you've promoted. If you're saying it's in the agenda, it's in your layout, make sure your slides are supporting what you said you were going to present. Generally speaking, for every item on the agenda, you should have at least one slide, maybe 1 to 2. And make sure it all ties back in and is consistent. When people are going back and forth in your presentation, you want them to be able to easily cover the content you're talking about. Then we also want to tie our slides together. How can we do this? Well, we can refer back to the agenda. That's always a good thing to do. That shows our audience consideration, number one. Number two, it lets them be able to ration out their own energy. I know that sounds kind of strange, but we only have so much of an attention span, and if we're able to see where we are in the presentation, we also know how much energy we need to preserve, and we also know the areas that might be more interesting to us in general. Some of the other things to consider, if you repeat the agenda, you also are letting people know where they are and how much more time we're going to spend. And we're going to also talk about trackers and how those are ways in which we can tie our slides together. So again, consistency. If you're promoting a phrase, if you're promoting a product, if you're promoting an idea, repeat it. By the time you've repeated something to the point where it feels repetitive to you, where it feels excessive, it's probably the right amount to be able to make that content stick. If you're using numbers, for example, make sure they match up with the agenda. If you use Roman numerals or traditional numbers, make sure they match with the agenda. And also, if you're using trackers, make sure they match up with your agenda. We'll show you what a tracker is sometime in the next slide or two. So repeating agenda, anytime you go back, it's great to show people where they're at. There's ways to show people where we are in the agenda using animation, color, or other kinds of tools. Rather than read these to you, I'm going to show you some ways in which we can tell you where we are in the agenda. For example, I can just use a little animation and an arrow. This is where we're at in the agenda. Or I can show you where we are in the agenda. Now, with that little animation, I'm going to use some cheesy animation to get rid of this and walk it off the screen. I don't encourage you to use that kind of gimmicky stuff, but I did it for point of emphasis here. We could also use a highlight text to show where you're at in a given point. Again, more gimmicky off there. And then we also, I like this one. It points out where we are in terms of the agenda, because we just went through tying the slides together, connectors, and next we're going to be choosing the type of slides that we're putting together. So again, all of these things are ways of letting our audience know where we're at. Trackers do the same thing. This is a tracker at the bottom of the screen. It's basically like a running head in an academic paper. Usually we put them in a watermark type setting at the bottom of the screen. Again, it's an easy way for us to say where we are in the agenda. Or you can use multiple methods as well. When we're designing our presentation, we also want to think what kind of slides we're doing in the first place. If we're doing deck slides, all that means is we're creating slides that are going to be either printed out or viewed by an individual on their own computer, not something necessarily projected. Then we have traditional projected slides, which we're used to seeing in conference rooms. And we also could have image-driven slides. And the difference between these later two, traditional projected slides, for example, don't have as much text on them typically as deck slides, but they have way more text than image-driven slides, which are just basically pictures meant for conversation. Think about the types of visuals you might see on a TED Talk. Those are image-driven slides because the emphasis is generally always on the presenter and not the content. So again, in terms of how these stack up, we understand where the person is going to be sitting, who's consuming this content, how big of an audience, all these things, again, factor in. Generally speaking, the medium for this is if we're getting into traditional slides. Most of the time when we're doing presentations in a classroom or a boardroom, that's what we're going to be doing. They all have advantages and disadvantages. For example, a deck's advantage, we can put more content in, and sometimes the audience will even consume it in advance. And we're also leaving hard copies. Sometimes the disadvantage to that of having a deck is we got a permanent record if it's information we don't want to leave behind. And if we are also using a deck, for example, sometimes people may be paying more attention to the slide deck in front of them than actually watching us present. And again, image-driven slides can be very compelling, but they don't carry a lot of independent information with context without a presenter. I think in many ways the sweet spot tends to be traditional slides for a balance of information and accessibility. So that gets us through the first part of our outline, and now we're going to go into how we design a master slide in general. We're talking colors, we're talking contrast, or how to really get into our branding. So our text really, really hates templates in PowerPoint. I don't necessarily agree. I think that templates can be useful, but we have to keep in mind that a lot of Microsoft and even Google templates are not business appropriate. What do I mean by that? Well, the templates have all caps, or they have wacky colors that don't really play well together, too much chart junk and other kinds of distracting visuals. And the biggest one that really irritates me is slides that do not read left to right. Headings that are in the middle of the left-hand side, for example, or on the bottom of the slide. In Western culture, we read left to right, top to bottom, and I really do believe those are the kinds of slides we should present. There's nothing wrong with modifying an existing theme. I did it for these slides. I did it with red, white, and black. Why is that? Well, because it's our St. Francis colors and because it works really well. I think if you use a plain theme, nice light backgrounds and dark text are great. And I also disagree with our text. I think you can make good use of templates. Now, if your organization has a template, why not use it? But if not, you can modify an existing Microsoft or Google template. So what do we want to think about? We want to think about what colors and approaches we're using, fonts, and types of animation. So colors really should tie in with your ideas. Again, I use red, white, and black because they're St. Francis colors. I think generally speaking, high contrast. When I say high contrast, I mean that the color for your background is way different than the color for your text. Generally speaking, I prefer light backgrounds and dark text. Some people like dark backgrounds and light text. So long as there's contrast, you're at least getting into a sound design principle. However, I think that the plain backgrounds are also great because these slides, although they might not be the most exciting looking slides in the world, print really well, even on a basic laser printer. So if your content can look good in basic printing, you've probably done okay. So in terms of your title, for example, I think high contrast is a great way to go for titles and text within limits. And here's what I mean by that. In the 90s, everybody in the world who had a web page had a black web page with red text. And although it is very high contrast, it can be very hard on the reader's eyes. I think, again, white backgrounds or light backgrounds and dark text work better. You can even do a light blue background and dark blue text if it's high enough contrast. And again, if you're doing decks, if you're going to be printing this stuff out, find something that looks good in black and white because you may end up having to reproduce it on a really bad photocopier. If you're doing something that's meant to be projected, again, high contrast. In terms of the accent color, if you want to accent key points, for example, the text says to deviate from the color scheme. I disagree. In fact, I still use red, even though red's part of my color scheme. So long as you're not overusing it and it has the effect of drawing attention, you can use a color that's already in your theme. I disagree with the text on this one. And again, I think it is good, however, to tie your color into your main points. For example, if you're promoting a company and your company color is teal, you can use an accent color that is teal that'll draw attention back to your company. When we say the fruit salad effect, it's funny, when we talk about nutrition, for example, a lot of nutritionists say you should have different colors on your plates. That shows that you're eating different fruits and vegetables. And that's great for nutrition. It's not good for our slides. If you're getting too many colors on the slides, it gets distracting. We call it the fruit salad effect. Check your colors. If you've got more than 3 major colors going on, you probably are getting into this range, so be careful with that. And again, with fonts, we talked in previous chapters about serif versus sans serif. I prefer, generally speaking, serif for most of my content, although you will notice I'm using a sans serif font for my headings. Sans serif says modern, serif says traditional. You can use them together. I don't think there's any problem with that. Nobody ever gets fired for using Times New Roman, however. And in terms of sentence case, here's what I mean by that, guys. Never should you have all caps on the content of your slides. If you want to use it for headings, you can. I'm not a fan. I think that using title case is okay, where you're capitalizing each letter on a title, but it gets fatiguing when you use it in the body of a slide. So again, readability. Sans serif is a little bit harder or more fatiguing to read than serif, and you don't want to use title case on anything other than the actual titles, and under no circumstances use all caps repeatedly in a presentation, unless you're using it 1 time or 2 times for emphasis. And again, if we're talking about variety, it is definitely the spice of life, but you should have no more. I think generally speaking, 2 fonts should be plenty. 1 for headings, 1 for your body, your slides. If you're getting past that, you're probably making it fatiguing on the reader. And again, if you need to draw an emphasis, use bold, italic, or underline instead of using a different font. Don't throw too many different spices into your food. In terms of size, I do believe that go big is the philosophy we should epitomize here. And here's some rule of thumbs that our text presents. Generally speaking, go bigger. If you are doing projected slides, I think that most of your fonts, if you are putting normal deck slides together, or I shouldn't say deck slides, if you're putting normal projected slides together, your headings should be no less than 36 points, and your text should be no less than 24, generally speaking. And again, go big. These are not hard and fast rules, and I break them occasionally too. We'll talk more about that. These are best practices, not hard and fast rules. So you can see the suggested sizes for yourself. If you're going into image-driven slides, then your headings can be even bigger in terms of their total points, point layouts. In terms of handouts, I really think when you're printing out handouts or your slides, if you're putting more than 3 slides on a Microsoft PowerPoint handout, for example, you're giving people something that's ultimately useless because nobody will be able to read the content on those slides. So 3 per page No more than that. You can also, by the way, lock in a template so that the sizes remain consistent on your Microsoft PowerPoint template or Google Slides. That's always a good thing to consider doing as well. When we start thinking about design cascades, what we mean basically is we go big to small, top to bottom. I have gone between using center titles and left flush titles. I generally like my slides to be left oriented, and that means we read left to right. Why not put it in a natural order? Some folks, for example, like bold-faced or italicized subheadings. I tend to not use those unless I really need to emphasize something. That's up to you, though. However, here's some examples of how not to do your slide layouts. What's the problem with this slide? In addition to the fact it's unreadable and using all caps, the justified left side with all the caps makes it impossible to really tell where the content begins or ends. Here's another great example of what not to do. There's no cascade in this style either. And look at this, even in the middle, we've got, because this person apparently wants you to see this amazing grill on the Ferrari, they actually moved over the start of the second bullet point, which doesn't even have a bullet, to be able to make room for that. Not good design practices at all. And again, so many problems with this slide in terms of orientation, you can't even follow what direction the content is going. Use animation as a tool, not a toy. Use it to build lists, use it to build out complex charts. I say use it as a pointer. What I mean by that is you can draw attention to different areas of the slide, just like I did in previous slides, by applying some of the animation. Now, your slides may also, by the way, serve as a permanent record. If you're giving handouts, for example, you want to think about this stuff as well. Number one, you're giving up information that people permanently carry with them. And number two, they may be looking at the handouts rather than looking at you as a presenter or paying attention. So if you do give handouts or permanent records, again, with deck slides, no more than 3 to a page printout, I think is the best way to go. If you are giving these as decks and you're not presenting your slide presentation as a computer presentation but as paper, then print them out 1 to a page so somebody can actually take notes on them. Well, let's get in now in terms of actually how we're going to design each individual slide. This is how we are deciding what types of content actually go in our presentation. What are things we want to think about? We want to think of our messages, our graphics and charts that we're going to be using, how much text is too much, and how we edit this stuff to get down to the main and primary content. Let's dive right into this. So your message, in terms of your main heading for each slide, again, to remind you of a concept we've talked a lot about this semester, don't use generic titles, use descriptive titles that make good standalone sense. Again, apply SAS, standalone sense. Can somebody read your title and know what that slide is about? So here's some examples of how to be more direct and effective. Engine quality versus engine longevity increased, hits the website versus website traffic increased. You know what I'm talking about. In terms of the titles in general, anytime you're going for the title of the slide, if you're going more than about 1.5 lines to even 2 lines maybe on a deck or 1 line if you're doing an image slide, your title is too long. Generally speaking, a good rule of thumb is your title for each slide should go about 1.5 lines, generally speaking. Again, our text recommends sentence case. I do, for titles, use title case, for example. That's a personal preference. I think that really comes down to what your main idea is of the presentation. If you come in with your title slides, they should be emphasizing what's on the agenda, for example. So what's good about using message titles? Again, you're giving people something to latch on to at the top of each slide. You're giving them an idea of what you're talking about in general, and you are reinforcing standalone sense. Again, we'll come back to that term repeatedly. So what about graphics and charts? They're really easy to do. Microsoft products are great, whether you're using PowerPoint, whether you're using Excel, or whatever. What I'm asking you to do, though, is consider what kind of chart is relevant for the information that you're presenting. Think about how you can present this stuff that's easy for the reader, and make sure that you're giving good information that's relevant to the presentation. Too much information, particularly in chart form, can really bowl people over. Our text has some really good guides on this stuff as well. I think that plain is better. The more plain you can go with your charts, the more vanilla, the more white bread you can go with the charts, the better. And here's what I mean. For example, if we get into chart junk versus improved graphics, the 3D stuff makes it tough to read. Make the content direct. Somebody's not going to marvel at how wonderful your 3D chart was. They're going to marvel at how good your data was and how quickly they can access it. So think about what makes it easy for the individual to watch your information or to absorb your information. So again, get rid of excess colors. Other things to think about, instead of using a legend, and a legend, by the way, is a key that shows, well, this color means this aspect, or this shape means this aspect. Label your charts directly where possible, and also consider eliminating black borders. Those also can make charts less readable. You also want to make sure that you are making your charts and graphics big enough so that anybody can see them. Again, remember, we're in a multi-generational workforce with people with all kinds of different levels of visual acuity. So in terms of concept diagrams, again, tie in with charts. Make sure that your diagrams make sense and they fit together well. Be careful with what we refer to as smart art. For example, in PowerPoint, you can create smart art with any kind of numerical information. But smart art sometimes is more difficult to edit than just creating a manual piece of graphic art. So here's an example. Our smart art will create things like pyramid or Venn diagrams, but sometimes it's easier to create them manually. It's one of these things, if you try to use smart art in very simple situations, it can be great. It can be absolutely aggravating in other situations. So when we are getting into the textural slides, and what I mean by textural is heavy text-laden slides, try not to overwhelm people with bullets. Now, this is not a hard, fast rule. Generally speaking, if you've got more than 6x2 on a slide that you're projecting, you've got too much. For example, I even broke it on this slide because I've got a total of 7 bullets. Sometimes you got to bend the rules because do we want to have another entire slide, or do we want to fudge and put one extra bullet on? These are our rules of thumb. What I will encourage you to do, though, is to avoid just giving so much text that somebody's basically reading your dialogue. Your slide should guide your presentation, not necessarily be verbatim. So again, in terms of other things to consider, we want standalone sense, whether it's in the title or the bullet itself, and consider using animation to build these lists when relevant. Other things to consider with bullets, for example, and PowerPoint language in general. PowerPoint language, what I mean by that is if you've got a keyword or a phrase, yes, repeat it. Make sure that somebody gets to learn it. With bullets, generally speaking, most important stuff up top, work your way down and avoid having a single bullet on a page. If you've got a single bullet, maybe you could put it on a previous slide, and we also want parallelism throughout, grammatical and conceptual. Other things as well, I think that using sentence case and having your bullets go from left to right makes more sense. And again, if you can avoid it, I do it on occasion because nobody's perfect. Avoid where possible having one word on a line, for example. What about photographs? I think photographs and images can be great, but they need context. For example, they can be great at the beginning of a presentation because they can be provocative. They can get people thinking, for example, but they can also be confusing if not given context. So think about how you're using photographs and visuals. Also think, is it looking good with your overall design? And the rule of thirds basically means all really good looking materials, whether they're projected or printed, have equal weight in all 3 areas of a screen. So the top heading, for example, in this particular slide, the using photographs heading is kind of a heavy piece of text. It's weighed against the bullets on the slide, and it's weighed against the little piece of clip art over here. We've got 1, 2, 3 major content areas. So the rule of thirds is a balancing act as well, and it really does look good on screens or printing. How can you get images? Well, you can use clip art that's built into many operating systems and Microsoft products, but there's also places to search for what we refer to as public domain photos. Those are license-free photos. Be careful. If you're using Google image search to be able to populate your slide decks, for example, or your PowerPoint slides, you may be including copyrighted material that could come back and hurt you later on if somebody sees that you used a copyrighted image without permission. Sometimes it's also wise to include maybe attribution if you are using specific images. Tell people where you got it. Well, in terms of editing, guys, when we're looking at the presentation, we want to make sure that we haven't overwhelmed our audience with text. Look at the whole presentation together. Are your slides fairly consistent, for example? Are there roughly the same amount of bullets from one slide to the next? What about the animation and the colors? Do the animation points all work in the proper order? Are the colors playing well on a projector? Cite your sources too, and make sure that if you have errors on your verbiage, you go back and editing them as well. I think it's always a good idea to test your slides in advance if you get a chance to. And let's just jump right into it. These are all important things. In terms of testing slides, if you're doing a presentation in a room you're not familiar with, get there early, see how things look. Different projectors, for example, have different levels of color quality and contrast. You want to make sure your presentation looks good. If you've got weird colors that are not translating well on an old projector, you have time to change to a more fundamental color setting, for example. Make sure your remote works, that the bullets are coming up in the right order. It's also important to decide where you're going to stand. Are you going to be in front of your screen, beside it, wherever? Because that's going to determine how people look. If I'm standing on one side of a room and I'm presenting on the other, people are going to have to choose whether or not they are looking at me or my slides. If you have a chance to control where people are sitting, you can focus their attention. And also, there's some good arguments to be made about when to hand out any materials you brought. If you hand them out at the beginning of the presentation, people may not pay attention to your presentation. At the same token, if you hand them out at the end, you may have eliminated their ability to take notes on some good handouts as well. That's totally up to you and your strategic purpose. So in terms of opening a presentation, I think it's great to use that opportunity. What are the big points? People remember the beginning and the end. It's a good place to connect with your audience. If you're getting ready to do a PowerPoint presentation, for example, a little pre-show chit-chat's okay, but I always like to get away from the audience so that I can get in my zone and get ready to present. When you are presenting, don't spend your entire presentation looking at your slides. Make sure you're making eye contact with the audience. They can read your slides. They can read them to themselves. Give them a reason to be there. In terms of transitioning between slides, our text has a term called TMOD, Transition, Message, Title, Orient, Discuss. Here's what that means. We go from one slide to the next. Maybe we refer to what we just talked about, and we look at what's coming next as well. Look at the title of the slide. Tell people what that is all about. Orient, meaning we're talking about any of the images or complex parts of the slide we're about to talk about, and then discuss it. This is not hard and fast. Sometimes you'll go right into discussion. Sometimes you may go back and forth, explaining the graphic that's on the screen. These are suggested best practices, not hard and fast rules. Well, that gets us down to our last point, which is actually using these visual aids. All right, let's dive in. In terms of cueing your audience, what we want to make sure that we're doing is we're controlling where our audience looks. We're using our slides themselves to be able to focus their attention. I think a lot of people have this idea that if they vaguely point at the screen that they're driving their content home. I would rather be able to emote with my hands, for example, and be able to show my personal enthusiasm rather than be just referencing randomly at a screen. So again, avoid using a laser pointer. If you can build some good animation into your slides, it'll help. I think it's always good to make sure that you are checking in with the audience too. For example, when we move from one content area to another, make sure you're doing the same thing with your slides. If you want to break the presentation for a moment, most projectors have a mute button on them, or you can even build a black screen into your presentation to be able to have some moments for conversation. Again, our slides are amazing. We spend a lot of time looking at them. Look at my amazing slides. But it's better off to be able to look at the audience. Don't be so hypnotized by your own content that you're not able to look away. It can be very intimidating to make eye contact with a crowd. It can also be very tempting simply to read our slides. By making sure we're making eye contact, we're avoiding being that person who just reads their slides to the audience. I do not use presenter notes. I like knowing my material so I can present it without notes, but if you are using notes, make sure there's some place where they are yours and yours alone, maybe on a second screen if you have that option. but making sure that you are keeping your eyes focused on the crowd. If you're using decks, if you're handing out decks, for example, here are other things you want to consider. You want to make sure you know your content so well that if you have to move around that presentation, that you can. You're going to go through it maybe with the audience. Your audience also, if you're giving them decks, may have gotten that content in advance. Well, if you're doing something with decks, printed materials, you also have to decide when you're giving them these materials at the beginning or even in advance. Have they seen the material in advance? If so, you probably don't need to cover it in such detail. You can even start with questions. This is a psychology piece, but if you're in the room with somebody who is looking at your printed materials or looking at your presentation on their own laptop, position yourself next to the person who's going to be making decisions, for example. And these are points to consider in any in-person presentation. If you're sitting in person with somebody around a table looking at a slide deck, you might not want to be sitting higher than the person who's making the decisions. You also want to make sure that you're not totally enamored with your own slide deck in the same way we get enamored with our own in-person PowerPoint presentations. And be ready to jump around, because especially if these folks have had access to your content before, they may be ready to jump into some other areas of conversation. Again, none of these are any different than doing a slide presentation with PowerPoint in real time in a room. You're still maintaining eye contact. You still want to make sure that the audience knows the purpose and that the deck itself hangs together with the layout that you've given it. And again, particularly when using decks, the folks who are consuming the printed material or the digital material you've given them can absorb this stuff quicker than you can say it. So don't read it to them verbatim, and make sure you're explaining the elements in the same way that you would if they were in person with you. Again, all of these points bear repeating, but they're no different than in person. You've got to make sure that you are giving them a reason to speak with you. I think, too, that particularly when you're sitting down, it can be difficult because when I'm walking a room, when I'm doing an in-person presentation, if you were in the room with me, you'd see me pacing as I present. It can be a little difficult when you're seated to keep still. Try to maintain professional decorum. Try not to shake your leg. Try not to put your elbows on the table. Try to maintain a professional kind of visage. When we get into the idea of using other materials too, some people still like using flip charts, for example. 9 times out of 10, the markers in the room that you've been booked for will be terrible. Bring your own markers if possible. Bring your own sticky notes, for example, your own Post-it notes. And if you have a possible scribe, somebody who can keep notes for you or write things down on the whiteboard while you're doing an interactive session so you don't have to do it yourself, that generally works out better. Folks, thanks so much for your time and attention. I'm looking forward to hearing more of your questions as we interact.